She went to dinner like any other night. Or at least, she tried to. The restaurant hummed with the easy music of people pretending their lives were ordinary low conversation. The clink of cutlery. A string quartet somewhere, just loud enough to soften the edges of the room. Evelyn Ross folded into that warmth and practiced the smile she'd perfected over the last few years, the one that made her look polite, content, unremarkable. It was a useful smile. Tonight, it was a necessity. Across from her, Derek Hale finished a sentence with a laugh that filled the space between them. He was the kind of man who could be charming enough to disarm anyone on first impression. His hand brushed hers in a way that said, without words, that he felt entitled to that contact. Around him, the room leaned in, and then drifted away. The light glinted off his watch. His jaw, the little pin at his lapel. He told stories with the kind of confidence that made other people fold themselves into his narrative, as if by gravity. He made people like him. Evelyn breathed shallow, counting heartbeats beneath her ribs, the way she had learned to count them when she needed to stay present. She was counting them now, because counting is something the body understands, when the mind is fraying one. 2. 3 anchor points against the rising panic. The food arrived. Fork to mouth, glass to lip, each motion, a practice merchandise of normalcy. She had thought about saying something. Earlier. Before the reservation. Before the valet took the keys. She'd rehearsed a version of this in the mirror. Speak calmly. Make a joke. Deflect. In the mirror, it felt possible. In the booth with Derek's grin, and the warm lamplight, it felt impossible. So she did what she could manage. She folded a small square of paper into a triangle and slid it across the table to the man at the next table. He was a man who invited attention, in the way some places invite rain unobtrusive. Inevitable. Lucas Grant Atalulun. A single plate in front of him. A bourbon half full at his side. He wore his solitude, like an accessory tailored, yet and edged. People in that neighborhood murmured about him in the same breath as they used certain names. Influence. Money. Favors owed. Rumor is a clumsy thing. But it fits nicely when people want a simple explanation for a complicated man. Evelyn's hand trembled when she pushed the paper. The triangle slid beneath the water glass, as if hesitation had weight. She smiled. The smile that said everything was fine and nothing needed explanation. The note was a single, terrible sentence. Next table. He kidnapped me. Don't react. It was the sort of message that had to be small, to be believable, urgent to be understood, and anonymous enough to be plausible. It was the only plan she could make in the space between a breath and a heartbeat. Lucas looked up once. His dark eyes caught hers for the span of a long blink. He read the words, with an impassive face, and folded the paper twice, with a motion so small it might have been a reflex. He slid it into his jacket pocket. No one in the room made a move. The violins underneath the conversation kept playing, as if an orchestra could supply a moral compass. Derek noticed none of it. His hand brushed her wrist in casual affection, and then tightened. A thumb, pressing where it shouldn't. The smile on his face did not reach his eyes. He leaned toward the menu, as if the world could be negotiated back into solvency by discussing a new wine. His posture said, "Do not be dramatic. Do not be difficult." He kept the conversation at the surface, and, for him, that surface was enough. Evelyn let the smile hold one more beat, and then another, until she felt the muscles in her face begin to hurt. She watched Derek speak as if listening to a recorded loop. She watched Lucas sip his bourbon and glanced toward the window. All the while, her hands were quiet in her lap, fingers flexing against a panic she could not say aloud. The car ride after the restaurant had the dull, suspended quality of a scene played in slow motion. Rain stitched the city together in silver threads, and the streetlights smeared through the windshield, like a smeared verdict. Derek drove with a practiced calm that sometimes felt like a costume he never took off. He asked her about work, about a friend's party next week, about 1,000 small things that were meant to be mundane. To fill the silence in the car was not empty. It was full of something heavy, small decisions that had already been made for her. "You shouldn't have made me look like a fool," he said once, so casually that it sounded like a complaint rather than a threat. His hand found her jaw, the way one might take a newspaper from a table. It was an exam in control. She did not answer. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Because the right answer might have been to argue, and the wrong answer might have been to get slapped. He hit her then. And the sound of the strike seemed to belong to someone else's life. Evelyn felt the air go out of her in a hot whoosh. Her lips split on the inside. Pain was sharp and immediate and honest, in a way that fear sometimes is not. The headlights passing on the road flattened the moment into an image she could hold apart from memory, a face she once loved, a hand that had once been kind. The wet smudge of rain on the window, but even inside the shock. She looked, and she saw as one looks for flints in a dark pocket, the motel's security camera over the parking lot small. Black. Recording. It became a talisman. Maybe someone would pull the footage later. Maybe someone would see the frame of her smile, the shape of Derek's car. Maybe someone would watch and place his face in a database, and name him for what he was. In fear. People invent hope, because the alternative is admitting the world might not notice when one person disappears. They stopped at a motel that smelled of bleach and old coffee. The room had a cheap lamp, a boxy TV tuned to static, and a bed that had seen many different bodies pass through. He used a false name at the front desk, like an actor switching costumes. She watched him sign the receipt, with hands that did not tremble. She practiced breathing that would keep her from speaking, from saying anything that could make his mood worse. She listened to the sound. The motel made the hum of the HVAC unit. The muffled laughter from the room down the hall. The distant thump of a television. It was a life made up of ordinary sounds that did not belong to them. When he slept hard. A heavy animal breath. Evelyn stayed awake, listing things she could do like a child, list safe words. Because planning is a way of keeping a mind intact. She felt the paper triangle in the jacket pocket in her memory, as if it were a small heart beating. She had sent a message, and someone had received it. She had no proof that the reception would translate to action. But the idea of a human having read the words, "He kidnapped me," and not instinctively flung himself into motion, was worse than the plausible inaction itself. Miles away. Lucas Grant touched the phone in his pocket, like a man making a quiet decision. He watched the restaurant's security footage on a screen, with a steady focus that made methodical obsession look like craftsmanship. There, framed between two booths, was a woman with a practiced smile who slid a tiny triangle beneath a glass. There was a man with laughter that could be weaponized. The camera caught the movement of a coat, the glint of a watch. Lucas rewound the clip and watched it again until the motion stopped being movement and became data, a license plate number in the reflection of a car window. The angle of a face, the shape of a hand. His face did not soften. It did not need to. He folded the napkin twice in his mind, like folding a map into neat sections. He did not make a spectacle. He moved quietly through a private set of contacts the city had learned to treat as a parallel infrastructure favors. Old debts. Men who could look without being noticed. He listened to a report about a car leaving the restaurant at a certain time. Then another, about a man who used many names. He took the information and layered it with other small details, until a picture began to emerge. "Track the car," he said into the phone. The command light, and exact, and irrevocable. His voice did not carry the weight of moral righteousness. It carried the weight of territory. The city, in his view, was a place with borders that required guardianship, and someone had breached an unspoken boundary. He closed the phone and folded his hands in his lap like a man folding a life back into a pocket. There was no applause in his silence. But there was motion, somewhere between the restaurant's clink of cutlery and the motel's humming light. Threads began to tighten. She learned the geography of fear, like one learns a second language, by repetition, and by necessity. Each small-town motel repeated the same patterned fluorescent light that hummed like an insect. Patterned wallpaper that tried to pretend it was wallpaper and failed. A vending machine humming loneliness in the corner. The names changed: Blue Ridge, Pine Haven, Route 40. But the routine was identical. Derek checked in under different names. He paid with cash. Always paid cash. He moved them at odd hours, and in a way that felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced the choreography of disappearance, until it looked like improvisation. At first, Evelyn hid in the small, obvious ways. She learned which drawers stuck, which lamps had dead bulbs, which bathroom mirrors loosened if you pressed the corners hard enough. She learned to pretend sleep, while cataloguing the shape of the room, as if she might need to describe it later. Floral wallpaper with a small tear near the corner. A coffee maker that always leaked. A chair with a missing spindle. Those details were not trivia, they were breadcrumbs. She left for someone who might be tracking her by clues instead of cries. Her strategies were simple and humble, which made them harder to spot. She scratched something behind a towel dispenser. The tip of a pen, digging thin letters into cheap plastic, until the name looked like an accidental blemish. She tucked a motel key behind a loose tile, pressed into the gap, and hoped the next cleaning person would notice and toss it into the pile that would eventually be found. She carved a partial address into the wood behind a headboard with a fingernail until her digits ached. Each act of marking felt like a small theft of agency. A way to prove to herself that she could still make things happen in a world that increasingly made decisions for her. Derek's behavior spun through a narrower set of motions. He was careful for a while. Calculating. Always scanning the parking lot, as if someone could materialize at any moment and accuse him of what he had done. Then he would relax. And the relaxation would curdle into something else: possessiveness that became a warning. Warnings that became shoves. Shoves that became punches. He watched her more closely. He counted her breaths. He invented slights, and then punished her for them. A predator, inventing a narrative, so he could play both victim and punishments in the same scene. Evelyn paid attention to the seams of his stories. He spoke of protecting them of dangers only he could see, but when he thought no one else was listening, his words turned ugly and small. People notice, he told her once. Voice, soft as if confessing illness. They notice when a woman asks too many questions. The line was meant to instruct, to train her into quietness. She started to measure silence, not just by how quiet the room was, but by whether the quiet kept her safe. As the days blurred, fear became a working mind. She learned to make the motel room itself into a tool. She loosened vents and tapped hollow places where a pen could be slid. She tucked a scrap of fabric into the seam of a mattress. She learned which cleaning staff were hurried and which were methodical, which would notice a pencil mark in a guest book, and which would not. Her small acts were a kind of invisible persistence. They were not dramatic. They were work. At the same time, somewhere, larger and darker, Lucas Grant was doing his own kind of patient labor. He had a room that looked like a brain, arranged as a machine screens stacked, like offering plates. Feeds of traffic cams and gas station footage, and license plate readers, blinking in and out of life. Men and women in his orbit moved with the economy of experts, an ex-military tracker reading a plate like sheet music. A cyber analyst pulling metadata from the thin air between towers. Lucas did not call this morality. He called it a job. Like pruning a tree so that a neighborhood could breathe. He did not expect thanks. He did not want it. The work was slow at first. A mosaic of small movements stitched together. They found a gas receipt from a truck stop 40 miles north. They matched it to a card used at a car wash 3 days earlier that had been purchased with cash and a fake name. Lucas layered these transactions against traffic cam footage until a route geometry emerged. A thin line of probable movement through the map. He watched Derek's car climb state lines and then dip into the radial roads that skated between towns and motels. Each camera gave them fractions of a face. A profile. A watch glinting in a reflection. Little things the way a car hugged a curb, or the dent on a bumper congealed into identity. It was not a hero's montage, it was meticulous. Methodical inference. Lucas's people moved quietly, as if they had honed discretion into a craft. They phoned contacts at convenience stores and small-town diners. People who remembered license plates, the way some people remember birthdays. They combed through motel guest books. The slow, steady grind of men who understood layered systems and holes in bureaucracy. For Lucas, the city's safety was a map with seams that needed mending. Someone had ripped a thread, and his curiosity was a needle. What kept him steady was not righteousness. It was ownership. "You don't take people from my city," he said once, more to himself than to anyone on the call. It was the kind of territorialism that lives on in men who have made themselves responsible for an invisible order. There was no altar there. Only a ledger. He wanted balance. Not price. As Lucas closed the net, the dynamic around Evelyn shifted. Derek grew smaller in his head and larger in his panic. He began to see shadows where none existed and reacted to them with the scalpel of increasing control. He began to carry extra cash and extra knives. He drove with his eyes always flitting to the mirrors, checking angles, paranoid that someone followed them. His careful choreography frayed into improvisation. When a man improvises violence, the result is terror that cannot be negotiated with logic. The weather turned while they moved. Rain became a character in the story, at first small, then a steady percussion that washed the horizon in a constant grayness. Rain makes noise. Rain makes visibility blur. In the rain, people become harder to spot and easier to forget. But rain also slows you down. It stalls departures and enlarges mistakes. It turned Derek's route into a single wet thread across the map, making his choices more legible to those who watched. From the dry, Evelyn used the weather as cover for a last small rebellion. At the hunting cabin they rented one night, with mounted deer heads, like witnesses on the wall, she found a hollow corner behind a baseboard and tore away a splinter. Her hands moved with a focus that felt like prayer. She took a scrap of fabric from her sleeve and scraped letters into it with the tip of a pen she had smuggled from somewhere in Derek's jacket. The message was simple and brutal. Lakeview Motor Court. Cabin 8. She hid the strip inside the wall, then hammered the baseboard back into place with a fingernail until nothing showed. She tasted the metal tang of fear and hope, indistinguishable on her tongue. Her chest ached from the effort of pretending that she had not done this, that this was not evidence of agency. When she slept, it was a restless sleep of someone half awake, aware that the smallest episode could become a map for others to follow. By the time the rain had blurred the edges of everything, Lucas's team had triangulated a smaller radius. They were moving in the dark, driven by the texture of small facts and the weight of many thin connections. Men in trucks rolled through county lines and spoke softly on radios. They checked license plate readers, compared tire treads, and left little traces of their own so as not to alarm motel staff. They moved like a shadow force, meant not to disrupt the neighborhoods they passed through, but to close around a single location with surgical discretion. When the discovery was made, it was almost anticlimactic. A cleaner's routine, discovering a scrap of fabric shoved behind a baseboard. A hotel worker, noticing lettering in the guest book. a gas station attendant, recalling a nervous man buying a six-pack, and asking where the motel off Route 12 was. The pieces came together, not because someone performed a grand gesture, but because a chain of ordinary people paid attention to ordinary oddities. Lucas called the name and numbers into his line, and watched as the men moved in a silent choreography. But the last line of the story is rarely neat. The scrap in the wall confirmed their suspicion. And yet when the convoy arrived at the coordinates, it was to find an empty bed and a television left, playing static. The car had left an hour earlier. Tires smudged across the wet gravel, like a signature that was already fading. Derek and Evelyn were gone. The twist did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like the tense pause before a second breath. For Lucas, it was a shift of tempo. The case widened again. A different pattern to decode. For Evelyn, it was a moment that mattered, because what she had done, the tiny act of hiding the note, had not been erased. It had punched a hole through the silence that someone else could see. The hunt was not over. It simply moved into a new act. The rain had turned the sky into a bruised mirror, the kind that reflected nothing but motion. The road to the lakeside motel was a narrow scar cutting through woods that seemed to swallow sound. Derek drove in silence, jaw tight, knuckles white around the steering wheel. His eyes darted to the mirrors, as if the ghosts of his choices were chasing him through the storm. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, wrists bound, lips split, the taste of copper sharp in her mouth. She didn't cry anymore. The fear had calcified into something harder. Get their focus. He talked to himself now. Low mutters about being followed. About people watching. About how none of this was his fault. They twist things, he said, voice cracking on the edge of hysteria. They make me look like the bad guy. But I kept you safe. Didn't I? I could have hurt you. I didn't. I protected you. Evelyn didn't answer. There was no answer that would change the world he'd built inside his head. She stared out the window at the sheets of rain slashing sideways, at the headlights fractured into halos. The motel appeared suddenly, hunched on the lakeshore, like a secret that didn't want to be told. He parked crooked, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her through the downpour into room 12. Inside, the air smelled of mold and cigarettes. A single lamp flickered near the bed. He teed her hands tighter. Double knots this time, as if the cords could hold together the pieces of his unraveling control. He paced. He checked the window. He cursed the rain. His paranoia filled the room like gas. Invisible but suffocating. You think someone's coming for you, he snapped suddenly. His face inches from hers. You think that little note mattered? Nobody's coming. Evelyn. Nobody cares. Her voice was soft, but it cut through him anyway. You're not in control anymore. He froze. The sentence hung between them. Fragile and final. Something behind his eyes flickered rage. Fear. Realization. He took a step toward her. And then, from somewhere outside, a sound the faintest creak of a floorboard. The shift of weight on wet wood. Derek's head jerked toward the door. Did you hear that he hissed? Evelyn didn't answer. She just stared at him. Calm in a way he couldn't understand. It unnerved him more than any scream ever could. The door opened without a sound. And for a heartbeat, the only thing she heard was the rain. Then, standing in the doorway, framed by the storm, was Lucas Grant. His coat clung to him, soaked through, his face unreadable, eyes cold and measured. Behind him, shadows moved, the quiet presence of men trained for moments exactly like this. Lucas didn't raise his voice. 7 days, he said evenly. You picked the wrong woman. The words landed like a verdict. Derek lunged for the nightstand, for the knife he kept there. But he never made it. 2 of Lucas's men were already inside. silent as gravity, disarming him with practiced precision. The struggle was short and ugly, ending with Derek, face down on the stained carpet, wrists pinned. The sound of rain filling the gaps where curses failed. Evelyn stayed still through it all. Her breath measured, eyes fixed on Lucas. He moved toward her slowly, deliberately. As if every motion was a statement, he cut through the bindings on her wrists with a pocket knife and stepped back immediately, giving her space. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to." It wasn't the words that made her believe him. It was the way he said them. Controlled. Certain. Not as a rescuer, but as a witness to her endurance. She flexed her hands, the skin raw and swollen, and for the first time in days, she felt her own pulse belong to her again. Outside, the rain softened into something that sounded almost like applause. Later, she woke to warmth. Not sunlight lamps, gentle light. Walls painted in earth tones. The quiet hum of a heater. The air smelled clean. The sheets were new. A safe house. They told her. Private. Secure. Somewhere the world couldn't find her, unless she wanted it to. A woman from Lucas's team sat beside the bed, checking her vitals, explaining every step before she touched her. "I'm going to check your wrist now." "Okay." Small acts of permission that built a bridge back to autonomy. Evelyn nodded, still half adrift. When the medic left, she noticed a folded napkin on the nightstand, beside a small leather-bound journal. The handwriting was precise, masculine. A message in black ink. "You don't owe anyone your story, but you own your survival. L.G." She touched the napkin with trembling fingers. It was clean. Crisp. New. But it carried the echo of that first one. The one that had started everything. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension unwind in small, painful increments. For the first time, her silence wasn't fear. It was peace. A year ago, I wasn't standing here. I wasn't standing anywhere. I was trying to survive minute by minute, breath by breath. I didn't think anyone would hear me, but someone did. And when they did, I realized survival isn't just staying alive. It's taking back the pieces of yourself that fear tried to erase. She paused, scanning the crowd. Survivors, advocates, law enforcement, journalistes. And at the back of the room, barely noticeable, stood Lucas Grant. No entourage, no spotlight, just a man in a dark coat, hands folded, eyes steady. When she met his gaze, he gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement rather than an exchange. She smiled, not out of gratitude, but understanding. On the stage beside her hung the foundation's new logo, a folded note, clean and simple, drawn in white against a dark background, a symbol of silence, and of what silence can still say. She touched the edge of the podium and spoke the closing line with a calm that carried every scar and every survival she'd earned. "This is for anyone who can't call for help out loud. We'll listen anyway." Applause rose and folded over her like a tide. Lucas turned and left quietly before it ended, disappearing into the soft rain. Later, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Evelyn walked back to her office. On her desk, under a pane of glass, rested the original napkin, creased, faintly stained, the ink smudged but legible. The words were still there. "Next table. He kidnapped me. Don't react." She traced the letters once with her finger, not to remember fear, but to honor the woman who had written them, the woman who had refused to disappear. Outside, the rain continued to fall, gentle and constant. The same way survival does. Quietly. Persistently. Rewriting the sound of the world. Sometimes the quietest voice can change everything. And if Evelyn's story moved you, if it made you pause, even for a second, then take that moment and share it. Because the truth is, stories like hers aren't fiction for everyone. Somewhere, right now, someone is living that silence, waiting for a chance to be heard. Your like, your share, your comment, they don't just help this channel. They help this story reach someone who might need to hear it. Tell us in the comments, what part of Evelyn's journey hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Every voice, every word, helps build a louder kind of awareness. If you believe stories like this matter, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Together, we can turn quiet stories into powerful echoes. The folded note, because silence can still speak.